In Chapter 10, we have the psychology of motivation and emotion. Motivation deals with why you and I do what we do, and then emotions are the feelings and bodily responses we have to experience. So happiness, sadness, maybe things like apathy or boredom are somewhat related to mood. It's the body's response to changes in our environment. Um, and there is a mental process involved in that, although it's not always clear exactly what the relationship is between thoughts about experience and emotion. But there's definitely a relationship between behavior, emotion, and thoughts. All right, so here we have a basic distinction in motivation that is well accepted, but it's a little bit more nuanced than initially shown here. So we can look at motivation as something that is extrinsic or intrinsic. Extrinsic motivation, and again, we're talking about why we do what we do. Extrinsic motivation comes from outside of us. So it's not coming from within, it's something outside of us. Usually if we're trying to get something outside of us, or we're being urged to do something by someone else, this is an extrinsic form of motivation. So if I am posting videos in order to develop my stature in the academic community or among teachers of psychology or even among students, and I want people to like me or appreciate me, then these would be extrinsic reasons for doing so. I'm trying to gain something outside of myself. Working for money is another example of extrinsic motivation, or working for recognition, or being nice to someone so they'll be nice to you back would be a form of extrinsic motivation. And then intrinsic motivation, in means coming from within, are personally driven goals. So things that come from inside of you, such as maybe recording videos because I like to, or recording videos because I feel like it's important that my students have access to maybe my take on some of these topics, and then other videos where I might have more expertise on a topic. I feel driven to do that because it's satisfying to me. And so these are intrinsic reasons for doing so. You might enjoy being a student because it's fun, or you might be in college because you want to develop your skill set so that you can be satisfied in a job. It might be important to you to help others. These are intrinsic goals, and it's very difficult to change someone's intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation can be very strong and not easily manipulated by others. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is highly flexible. All you need to do to change someone's behavior is remove their extrinsic motivation. So for example, in a classroom, I can say, the following activity won't have a grade assigned to it. So I'd be removing the grade extrinsic motivator, and now all that's left is students' intrinsic motivation. If they are not interested, it shows that they are driven to learn by extrinsic rewards. All right, so we can look at the different types and different nuances within both of those. And so I'll let you take a look at how extrinsic rewards work. And then we have, so William James has a theory of motivation that goes back over 100 years, and it looks like he writes, and I'm not familiar with William James on motivation. He proposed an instinct theory of motivation, asserting that behavior is driven by instincts. So it's difficult to talk about instincts as motivations or decisions for doing things, but if I get hungry, for example, I might be really driven to eat. And so I know nutritionally my body requires certain macronutrients like protein and fat. And if I'm missing one mineral or one vitamin or some macronutrient, I will crave that specific thing. So a craving is a very strong motivator, but I also know it's driven by evolutionary instinct. So we can understand some of our behaviors by these instincts. Another approach to understanding motivation is the idea of drives, and this comes from psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysts understand that our behaviors are driven from within, kind of like a steam engine heating up water so that it expands, and the expansion has to go somewhere. And so we can think of our motivations inside as these drives. And for example, if you're sexually aroused, it's like this drive coming from within, and you have to act on it, or you have to suppress it actively, or shift it towards some other target or goal. I think sublimation is the word for that. But the idea that we have these hidden drives, and they'll come out somehow. And in order to solve problems, we need to understand where those drives are coming from and what it is specifically that's driving them, so that we don't try to suppress them, which can lead to problems in psychoanalytic theory, at least. So we can see the drives, and again, we don't know that there are drives. This is a hypothesis that comes from psychoanalysis. But we can see drives in the physiological changes. So if I'm hungry, I'm going to get like restless, and I can't focus. And so all of a sudden, I'll either have to actualize that drive, I'll have to find some way of satisfying the drive, or be miserable. In this, that's not what this slide is about. I apologize. This slide talks about how when we're doing any sort of activity, there's an optimal level of physiological arousal, a prime level of physiological arousal. And you know this. If you're taking an exam, for example, and you're really tired, and so your arousal level is very low, then you're gonna have trouble focusing. You'll keep kind of drifting out or falling asleep. And so you need to increase a certain level of arousal so that you can be focused and read the questions and think about the answers, and you're more engaged. But if you keep cranking that arousal level up, you're going to be so like antsy and on edge that you won't be able to focus either. And so you can have too much arousal or too little arousal. There's a prime or optimal level of arousal. And so that's the arousal theory. And this is, again, talking about motivation, or success. In this example, is successfully accomplishing a goal. And we can understand, using the arousal theory, the different points of optimal levels of arousal based on how easy or hard the task is. So in this graph, and this is charting the Yerkes-Dodson law, on the x-axis we have arousal level again, and then what does it say? Oh, performance quality on the y-axis. The red the red curve here are easy tasks, and then the blue curve is difficult tasks. So it looks like for difficult tasks, we want to have slightly lower levels of arousal in order to have that optimal level. So maybe like complex logical tasks, we can't have super high levels of arousal, but that's okay if we're doing something that's simple. So think of like working on a factory line, you're building parts. It requires some focus, but it's not super difficult. So you can do that relatively easy with a high level of arousal, and that keeps you going. But if it's a complex task and you have this high level of arousal, you might make more mistakes, or more likely to make mistakes. Then there's this idea of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is an individual's belief in his or her own capability to complete a task. So we can appreciate that it's important that you know you can accomplish something in order to help you accomplish it. And if you feel like you're going to fail, you're more likely to fail. So the expectations you have about your behaviors will influence your success at those behaviors. So one of the examples of this is self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you believe that you'll pass a class, and you're certain of this, you're more likely to pass the class. Or if you think like, oh God, I'm going to fail this exam, you're actually setting yourself up to do poorly on the exam. And so self-efficacy plays into accomplishment of your goals. All right, so we also have social motives for our behavior. And so again, these are some of those extrinsic motivations I mentioned earlier: needing to achieve or have accomplishments, needing other people to interact with you and appreciate you, need to build relationships. And these social motives are well recognized in self-determination theory, which is something that I have done research on. I'm sure there'll be a slide on self-determination theory. In the 40s, I guess, Abraham Maslow proposed a hierarchy of needs. Let's see if another slide goes into detail. Nope. A hierarchy of needs. This is just based on his observations, and so and it's been well received. I guess people recognize how they fit into it really well. And so the basic idea behind his hierarchy is that we have basic needs that have to be fulfilled in order for us to think about anything else. So there's this bottom of the pyramid, and we need to have that bottom secure before we can move up to these higher levels of goals or needs that we have. So the basic ones are: we need to eat, we need to have water, we need safety and protection. We need to have a habitat in which to live, like a home, or at least know where we're going to sleep at night. And then we need warmth or thermoregulation. And if any of those are unbalanced, then we can forget about higher order needs. But once we have those established, and most of us living in first world countries of means, so we're not talking about destitute and impoverished families, most of us have pretty good security there, and so we can move up to these security needs. Sorry, I used the word twice. And those include, like, you know where your dinner's going to come tonight. You don't feel threatened. You don't think you're going to die that day. And so it's important to have, once you know that you have food to eat, once you know that you're not like freezing or super hot, you're not dying of heat exhaustion, then you can worry about whether or not you're safe or if you're employed. So you have like a future sort of setup for yourself. You're protected. Then you can move up to these social needs, building relationships, feeling appreciated, and then like your own self-worth up there a little bit higher, what you've accomplished, how proud you are of your accomplishments, and then finally self-actualization, which is this: you feel complete, you feel like what you do matters, you feel like it's coming from within, and you are your whole person, and your needs are wholly actualized. The whole area of like eating and eating disorders and metabolism and body weight control also fit into motivation, so we'll see a little bit of that here too. We can understand the mechanisms of metabolism, or the mechanisms of eating, weight gain, weight loss through metabolism, and the nervous system and the hormonal system, but I'm not going to go through each of these items, although it is a fascinating topic to explore, and I recommend you do so. I just read a book about metabolism, so I have to try to avoid going into super detail, but let me just point out some of the areas of focus here. So there's how many calories you burn on average every day, and that's pretty much set. And it's not easily influenced by lots of exercise or a sedentary lifestyle. You have a basal metabolic rate, and so that's kind of connected to set point theory, that we all have this ideal body weight. Now, in the United States, in particular, developed countries, we have access to these highly processed foods, which have they're very dense with calories, and so that's why we tend to overeat, and why obesity and overweight statistics are climbing and have been steadily climbing. But if we didn't have all these dense caloric foods and highly processed foods, we would remain a healthy weight like our whole lives. So it's really important that we monitor the quality of the food that we're eating and not how much food we're eating. But if we don't want to monitor the quality of food, then we may want to count calories. So here we've got a BMI chart, and over here we've got like morbid obesity and overweight factors. And so I think right now, and you can calculate your BMI by a ratio of how much you weigh and how tall you are. The reason why BMI is used is because there's an increased likelihood of cardiac disease the higher your BMI is. And actually, you can have too low of a BMI. So if you're below the normal range, you have an increased likelihood of cardiac disease again. So skinnier isn't always better. So a BMI of 25, and you can find your height and weight on this chart, but a BMI of 25 to 30 is overweight, over 30 is obese, and then over 40 is morbidly obese. I think at least 60% of American adults are overweight or obese. Pretty big number. If you are obese, there is an increased likelihood of cardiac disease. That's why it's defined as it is. Stroke, type 2 diabetes, certain types of cancer, inflammation problems, liver disease, sleeping problems, and other metabolic cancers. How do you reduce weight? It's mostly diet. It's like 95% diet. And then exercise is included here, but I think there's pretty good evidence that we overestimate how effective exercise is at losing weight. Exercise is important for health and well-being, and for reducing the likelihood of a lot of cardiovascular diseases, but it's not very good at reducing weight. Diet is primarily what's important. You can also manipulate the size of your stomach using bariatric surgery. Now we've got those drugs you can take. I forget what the common one is, but what it does is influence your appetite, and so you're less likely to eat as much. That's a type 2 diabetes treatment, but it's being used for loss of vanity weight. And I'm not sure what the long-term consequences of that drug will be. Some people have a bad relationship with food, and I don't have a great relationship with food myself. One example of this eating disorder, and so again, this is a problem someone has with their food and their body image. One of those is bulimia, and bulimia has to do with binging. So either eating lots of food and then to kind of like experience the dopamine rush of food and then throwing up, or like causing yourself to get rid of all of that energy. And so it's it leads to all sorts of problems, one of which is loss of energy. You're not consuming energy, and you need a certain amount of energy to survive. But that can also happen by like excessive exercise or use of laxatives. So these are ways of preventing the energy from really being used to restore your body. And so that's bulimia. It has to do with like controlling your body, and it has health effects, health consequences. Another one is anorexia, and that is more linked to a distorted body image. And so no matter how skinny you get, a person with anorexia will look at themselves and feel fat. So they can be objectively underweight, yet still feel like there's room to lose weight or feeling fat. And so it's a delusion they have when they look at themselves. And both of those eating disorders, people can benefit from therapy. Some of the contributing factors to eating disorders include low self-esteem, stress, abuse and bullying, certain types of personality, and then it can run in the family. And it looks like children, Caucasian females, so teens, ages 15 to 19, from Western societies are the most at risk, but it's definitely seen worldwide in developing and developed countries. Another area of motivation psychology is sex. And so I mentioned that earlier as one of the instincts from the William James's instinct theory of motivation. And so anything related to sex and sexuality is going to be, we can study it from a motivation perspective. So we'll look at some of the physiological mechanisms, 2 big research studies, and then sex orientation and gender. The hypothalamus we've recognized throughout all of these chapters is a really important part of regulating hormones. And so, of course, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, all of these are going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. So, of course, sexual arousal will be influenced by the hypothalamus. The amygdala and the nucleus accumbens, I'm not familiar with the nucleus accumbens, but we know the amygdala is related to strong emotions. So it looks like damage to these areas can result in reduced sexual behavior. I wonder if that leads to an increase in fear. And if you're afraid, remember, like the hierarchy of needs, you can't worry about reproduction and self-satisfaction. Kinsey was one of the first psychologists to do a scale on sexuality. And so when I say sexuality, I'm talking about heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality. And at the time, it was believed that everyone was a little bit bisexual. At the time, it was believed that homosexuality was a disorder. And then later, after it was accepted as normal, there was a belief that everyone is a little bit bisexual. And so like, everyone has this spectrum of sexuality. And so what Kinsey did was recognize, I wonder if there's no, they don't have the chart, came up with a scale that went from 0 to 6, and 6 was, and the scale is based on previous sexual experiences. So if you've had sex or you've had a sexual encounter, then it can be classified as heterosexual, which means you're having a sexual encounter with a person of the opposite sex, or homosexual, you're having intercourse or an activity with someone of the same sex. And so you just count the number of encounters you've had and label them heterosexual or homosexual, or bisexual, I guess, if there's multiple partners. And then if you're a 6, you've only had homosexual encounters, and if you're a 0, you've only had heterosexual encounters. But if you're a 1, you have mostly heterosexual encounters, but some homosexual encounters, and so on. A 3 would be bisexual. And so there's this scale, a sliding scale. Some people are 6s, some people are 0s, and some people are somewhere in between. So it's recognizing that there is this, we're not all the same, that there's a lot of variability when it comes to sexuality. So some of the big takeaways, I guess, here are that women are just as interested in experiencing sex as men, so men aren't more sexual. Both genders masturbate without negative health consequences. That's important to say because, again, going back 80 years, and even less, 60 years, it was believed that masturbation was a cause of psychological disorders. And so there's a lot of links to religion there. And that homosexual acts are common. And so if this was in the 40s, that was pretty shocking because homosexuality was considered a disorder until the 1980s in the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders. Masters and Johnson were 2 behavioral psychologists who studied sex as an act with reinforcement. So like we get reinforcement at the end because it's pleasurable. And so they went through all the steps of the sexual act. It wasn't uncommon for them to like bring in sexual partners and have them perform the sexual act in a classroom to demonstrate the steps or the parts. They also had pretty shocking means of sex therapy, like if someone was inhibited sexually, how to help them out, and one of those was like using a surrogate partner to practice. You can read their books. I think they're still in print, actually. Some pretty shocking work that was done, but definitely important. They were one of the first duos or researchers to study sex without thinking it's taboo, but like study it formally in a laboratory. And so you can see that these are the steps of the arousal cycle. And I'm not going to go into that. You can read about it. Sexual orientation. And so when we say sex, we usually talk about male, female, sex characteristics. Sexuality, we're talking about relationships, so sexual activity. So sexual orientation deals with homosexuality, bisexuality, heterosexuality, or even asexuality, a disinterest in sex. And it used to be thought that homosexuality was a disorder and it could be treated, but there was no evidence that homosexuality is a disorder, A, or B, it can be treated. So here we've got, sexuality deals with the relationships that we have. Gender deals with the social performance that we, I guess, identify with. And so when we say I identify as male, I identify as female, we're not talking about external sex characteristics or even the relationships we have. It's the social role we wish to perform. So, for example, with my own appearance, I identify as male, but not everything that I do is inherently masculine. So like I have long hair, which I've been criticized for by boys in particular, but some adults, as being feminine. And so it's like, why do you have long hair? I have long hair because I like it. I like to take care of my appearance and things like that, which are not traditionally masculine traits. So again, these aren't dealing with my external sex characteristics. They're not dealing with my relationships and my romance. It's the social performance that I'm playing or that I'm exhibiting. And so I very much can wish to embody more feminine activities or masculine activities, so female and male respectively. And so the criticism of choosing, when people say like you can't choose what social role you're playing, we're always choosing what social roles we're playing, and our culture defines what qualifies as masculine and feminine, and we can choose to follow those expectations or adjust them and alter them. So we see a much more we see much more variability across social performances, and those performances challenge the expectation that boys, girls, and non-binary persons act a particular way. And so I very much doubt there will be a slide on non-binary. So we've got some gender transitions. And so when we're talking about gender, we have maleness, so acting as though one is a male, femaleness, acting as though one is a female, and then the non-binary is choosing not to fall into one category or another. And it's really courageous, in my opinion, to not kind of identify with a category. And we're seeing a lot more acceptance of that, at least in some countries, but there are some countries in which it is criminal and punishable, in some cases by death, and that's a little bit shocking. Then we get to transgender. So this is a person who was born and treated as though and conditioned to become and encouraged to be one gender and perform that gender role, and having the external sex characteristics of that gender, and then not identifying with it. And actually identifying with another gender and going through, so there's a period of recognizing that. And so that would be a pre-operation transgender person, and then choosing to go through the operation and have the external sex characteristics changed. So for example, a male external sex characteristic, primary external sex characteristic is a penis. And so having that removed would be, and then maybe the addition of breasts, so like a secondary sex characteristic for women, going through that transition, going through the surgery. So afterwards, they are a post-operation transgender person. And so there are a lot of categories that are involved in that depending on when the hormone treatment starts, when the surgery occurs. And so it's very easy to dismiss the whole process as irregular and therefore aberrant. But it's recognized in psychology as something that While not common, it's not disordered. So I just wanted to emphasize that. So here we have a person who is openly transgender. And so this was one of the first transgender actresses to portray a transgender character on regular television. So transgender is a person who has gone through a gender transition or is going through a gender transition, different from a transsexual or a transvestite, which can deal with performing as another gender without identifying with it. And that's not necessarily a sex act either. All right, so all of that was motivation, and now we're shifting into emotion. And so not why we do what we do, but how our body and our hormones and our emotions respond to our experiences. This is studied phenomenologically, or studying the structure and meaning of our experiences, as mood. And mood is how we're relating to a situation. So we can relate to something in an engaged, kind of excited way, or maybe like a disinterested, distant way. These are all forms of mood. An emotion, more specifically, is the physiological change or response to changes in the environment. So my heart rate might increase. I might start sweating. These would be signs of arousal, and there are a couple of emotions that are marked by arousal. Children can cycle through emotions quickly. That's what the slide says. There's not a whole lot of emotional regulation in children, and there's not a whole lot of complexity in the emotions shown. But as you get older, you learn how to manage your emotions, not necessarily hide them or resist showing them or experiencing them, but just understanding them and regulating them so that you can maintain kind of an even emotional state for a while. You can be happy all day or not be so affected by periods of depression or sadness. There are at least 3 primary theories of emotion, and I'm not going to go into detail about them, but I'm just going to talk about how they differ and what the factors are. So the main factors have to deal with a change in the environment, and just to give us a common example or an easy example, would deal with fear, something that you're afraid of. If someone were to walk into my office right now with like a knife or with a gun and yell at me, in that experience, I would probably become afraid. So what's the relationship between the event that happens, my physiological arousal, and my recognition that I'm afraid? Do I see the attacker and think, oh God, like they could kill me, I should be afraid? Like, is it a cognitive process that then makes my heart start racing? Or does my heart start racing before I even realize what's going on? And I interpret my heart racing and the person holding a gun as, oh, I'm afraid. The James Lange theory and the Cannon-Bard theory differ as to when those two, or what the sequence is between those steps. And you can read about them and come up with like examples of what that might look like in each of the different theories. But there's actually evidence to support both of them. But the best one, in my opinion, is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion, and that's when my physiological arousal and the change in the environment are both interpreted by me intellectually. So the assailant comes in, and I see them, my heart starts racing, and I have to pair those two things together. So my recognition that I'm afraid is based on my heart racing and an appraisal of what's going on in my environment. And that's been shown in a bunch of really interesting experiments, which you can read about by reading Schachter and Singer. And Dutton and Aaron had another really good study. And then there's the Lazarus cognitive mediational theory, which I'm not very familiar with. So it says, unlike the Schachter-Singer model, appraisal occurs before the label. Appraisal is immediate and unconscious. So rather than looking at what's going on and saying, I think I must be afraid, this is the Lazarus cognitive mediational theory is that the appraisal process is unconscious, and it happens immediately. There isn't a pause, in other words. And I'm not sure how that could be tested. I'm sure there would have to be a stopwatch involved. I think here is a comparison of the different theories. Yeah, James Lang, Hannibal, Schechter, Singer, Lazarus. So you can compare them on that slide and blow it up, and so you can see them all and compare them. When emotion is happening, the four previous theories talk about how it occurs and the sequence in which it happens, but we can also understand just like what's going on in the body and looking at that physiological response portion of emotion. And so here are some of the systems that are involved, and these are loosely called the limbic system. So the limbic system is in the brain here, this area. And the limbic system is generally just referred to as the emotional center. So the amygdala deals with, from my understanding, it's like fear, anger, aggression, but evidently it's involved in more than that. Probably arousal emotions. And then, of course, the hypothalamus is going to be involved because it's controlling all the hormone systems and like the heart rate. And the thalamus is a sensory relay center. And so that we feel emotions, of course, the thalamus is going to be involved. And then the hippocampus was related with memory, you recall, you remember. So, of course, if emotions or an experience brings back memories, and with that come a flood of emotions, it's going to be involved as well. So you can see how each of those regions of the limbic system help mediate the emotional experience. Then we have, so this is part of the amygdala in particular, and I'm not super familiar with this. Apparently, are these regions, basolateral complex, so parts of the amygdala, so there's the basolateral complex, looks like the area around the amygdala, and then the central nucleus. Both of these parts, so the amygdala is more complex than I was originally thinking. So the basolateral complex is important for conditioning. So the fact that we can learn to be afraid of something, like the little Albert study. And the central nucleus deals with attention. So maybe becoming preoccupied with something, or if we're not aware of something happening, so if someone came into my office with a gun and I didn't notice them, or I didn't pay attention to them, of course, I wouldn't have quite as strong of a response. So we can see that just within the amygdala itself, there's a complex series of activities that are going on. We can also recognize emotion in each other, and I think there's a lot more recognition that's happening that we don't have words for, or we have to develop language for. We might get a sense that something is off, and we might even start behaving a different way without knowing exactly why. And so there's this complex interrelationship in between people that is our awareness of emotion, even if we don't have the language to describe it. And so here's an example of people displaying facial expressions, portraying emotions, and these tend to be intercultural. So it doesn't matter where you find yourself in the world, you're going to recognize these same kind of facial expressions and understand, maybe intuitively, what it is these people are feeling. So there's a facial feedback hypothesis. Oh, does smiling make you happy? So are we, when we're happy, just responding to what our body's doing? So if someone tells us a joke and we laugh instinctually, now we feel good because we're smiling. There's some support for this. So if you make someone smile more, they are more likely to report being happy. So it could be related to memories they have when they're smiling. So by forcing a smile, they're flooded with these memories of similar facial expressions. These are just some ways of explaining why that might happen. Apparently, they injected depressed people who were sad with Botox so that they couldn't frown. And when they couldn't frown, they were less likely to be sad. So there were lower levels of depression injected with Botox. Maybe another reason why Botox is used. And that brings us to the end. Kind of felt like we were all over the place with that chapter, but we spent a lot of time on motivation and a little bit of time on emotion, and hopefully link some of those things together. As you can recognize, there are a lot of parts of the brain that keep coming up that are involved in a lot of different processes.